I'm Craig Timm, and this is ACAMS Live. Well, thank you to everyone out there for joining today. For everyone who's watching on replay, feel free to say hello in the comments. Let us know where you're tuning in from. I've got it right here on my phone. I'll try to keep an eye on that. If you've got a question, you can put that in the comments too. Want to try to make this as interactive as possible. Well, today we are going to focus on fraud. Fraud is exploding everywhere. The criminals are operating with a scale and sophistication that we haven't seen before, and governments, law enforcement, and the private sector are all struggling to respond. Now, against this backdrop, there are some countries that are on the cutting edge when it comes to what they're doing to detect and prevent fraud, and the UK is one of them. So today, I'm so excited to be joined by two experts from CIFAS, a nonprofit organization that helps prevent fraud and financial crime in the UK and beyond. They're going to talk to us about the future of fraud prevention, both in terms of intelligence sharing and the UK government's response. So the two guests are, I've got Rachael Tiffen. She is the Director of CIFAS Learning and Public Sector, and Ruth Ray, Director of Strategy Data Strategy, at CIFAS. So Rachael and Ruth, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so let's jump right in. We've got a lot to cover. Rachael, let's start with you. Let's start by just maybe level setting. There's going to be viewers from around the world. They may or may not have heard of CIFAS. So if you could just tell us a little bit about what CIFAS is, who your members are, and what you do.
Sure. Okay. Thanks, Craig. Well, as you said, we're a not-for-profit company. Our vision is to eradicate fraud. We have around 770 members, 17 sectors-ish, financial services, telcos, public sector, gambling, retail, and many others. We have the largest data, intelligence and knowledge community in the UK. And we protect organisations and individuals from harm. We have three pillars of activity, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of those today. But our first pillar is on data, and we have three databases. Hopefully Ruth's going to talk about one in a minute. But we have our National Fraud Database, which is based on external threats. We have an insider threat database, which is obviously based on insider. They're available 24/7 to our membership, the 770 members. And we also have third-party data sets that sit within there. And we have innovative tools that our members can use and features within there. Our second pillar of activity is our intelligence pillar, which Ruth will talk a little bit about intelligence at some point. We have a wide community. We do threat updates, and we produce something annually called Fraudscape, which contains statistics, patterns and trends that we see from our membership. And the third pillar of activity is one of the areas that I manage, our learning directorate. And we offer a number of qualifications. They're Ofqual, SFJ, registered, that's Skills for Justice. They're proper qualifications, but we also have shorter courses, which aren't full-scale qualifications. We do digital learning, all available to our members and non-members, and we do quite a lot of bespoke training for others where people say they'd like something that we offer, but can we tweak it a bit? And we offer around 31 different courses, so quite a kind of developed learning activity. So that's really what we're about.
Excellent. Well, Ruth, as previewed by Rachael, I want to drill down a little bit on information sharing, because I think, when it comes to being more effective at financial crime, information sharing is so important. I mean, really with all financial crime, but particularly when it comes to fraud. So can you tell us a little bit more about how the information sharing that CIFAS facilitates works? What are the outputs? Take us under the hood a little bit.
Sure, of course. My favourite topic, of course. So we host a number of data products and services, which are all governed by their own bespoke framework to ensure compliance and data integrity primarily. And I think that's largely what we're known for as an organisation, having a very robust governance framework. But primarily, our members all sign up to a reciprocity agreement. So those that search and use our databases must also share. And it's that reciprocity that is one of our sort of key principles of membership, and which creates that trusted community of fraud fighting professionals, where they all feel that they've got a role to play and they have value to contribute and take out of the system as well, to try to mitigate fraud and financial crime risk across their organisation. So some of those products and services have been in operation for a number of years, as Rachel described. We've also been through a huge innovation program over the last couple of years and introduced a number of new services, which are trying to sort of flip the process on its head and provide risk information more proactively to our members. We've also are just launching a new intelligence service, which is seeking to provide actionable intelligence that is below the standard of evidence required for our national fraud database, which is very high. So more suspect fraud intelligence, and that's going to really change the game, I think, in terms of value to our members, where below the waterline, as we could say, we're going to be starting to share a lot more information that members are able to use as part of a much broader investigation to identify more fraud and hopefully stop it before it comes through the door. So as part of our community, though, I've probably got to mention that it's not just our 700 plus members that are all fighting the fight with us. We've also got a number of trusted partners. We've got really fantastic relationships with government, law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, tech and data companies that all share data with us. We engage with on a regular basis. They are very much engaged in the process of development of our products and services, and also help us distribute data to those that need it most. So we've both got our legacy products that are tried and tested. We've also got so many more that we're really excited to introduce and have been introduced this year, and are really focusing our efforts on adoption of those products across the membership at the moment.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I was and for those outside of the UK, I was jotting down some common themes that I've seen in successful information sharing initiatives. These are essential to better fight financial crime. There are some common themes across the world, and you ticked off a number of them that I think are, for others thinking about this wherever you are, trust probably being the most essential. That is, you cannot do this unless you have you build trust and have facilitate trust across the group. Everyone contributes and has skin in the game. You can't have free riders along. The use of technology is so important with speed. And then the public and private sector, like really, if you don't have that together, you're going to be missing a piece of the intel. So I think that's, you can it sort of leaps out some of the ingredients that are clearly essential to the success of CIFAS, but then really information sharing around the world. I want to get now into some of the details around, you guys facilitate this great information sharing. You've got access to so much information. There's so much we can learn from that. And I want to turn now to one of the big trends that is, unauthorized fraud, or in the UK, it's often called authorized push payment fraud. As financial institutions have gotten better, particularly at unauthorized fraud. So that's when, a bad guy steals your credentials or tries to hack into a system, as opposed to authorized fraud, when it's really the victims are being tricked into sending money to the criminal organization. So whether that's romance fraud, investment schemes, or otherwise. And so I want to drill down on authorized push payment fraud. I saw the UK Payment Service Regulator came out with a report this week highlighting this as a growing threat. And so, Ruth, if I can stick with you for a second, what are the latest trends that you and your members are seeing when it comes to authorized push payment fraud, or APP fraud? So
APP continues to be our most talked about problem for our members that they're trying to solve. And with our product development, we always try to make sure that we are developing in an agile way, developing products that meet the needs of members today and into the future. So I've been working very closely with a subgroup of members in our banking sector over the last 18 months or so, co-creating a new victims protection product called APP Victim Check. which is effectively a database of APP victims that our members contribute to, for the sole purpose of helping to prevent those APP victims from becoming victims again, which I'm sorry to say has a relatively high prevalence. And if you think of a world where we all have multiple bank accounts nowadays, there may be a scenario where you bank with one provider and another provider that you bank with doesn't know that you've been a victim of APP fraud, and you may need additional safeguarding measures implemented to prevent you from being victimized again. So again, this is about trying to get more data out to more of our members to help them better assess the risk that they have in their existing books of business, so they can both file APP victims when they become aware of them into the database, and also search it to identify where they may have someone on book who is in need of some additional protections and safeguarding measures, be that additional education. It might be some more personalized education and messaging and support from that bank. But through that process of co-creating that product with that steering group, we've really heard the devastating impact on victims of APP fraud, and that's not even to mention the financial cost, which is phenomenal. The recent UK finance report, their latest fraud report recently, has really highlighted the scale of cost of APP fraud in the UK. But this isn't just a UK problem. This is certainly something that's far more extensive. But what we do know is that it's becoming more of a serious and organised international threat, now operating at quite a scale. We know that the majority of this crime perpetrated is coming from online channels, around 72%. So there is far more that we can all do to share data to try to really get a handle on this and better protect victims. However, that said, the UK is really ahead of the game at the moment in implementing the payment systems regulators regulation that came in on the 7th of October. And that really goes a long way to helping victims rebuild their lives after a devastating impact of fraud. But it's something that we all need to come together more on, because the APP fraud figures don't seem to be dipping terribly fast, not fast enough. So there's still an awful lot more we can do there.
Yeah, and I want to get into that because I think it's something that countries everywhere are struggling with. It's often the number one topic with governments. What are you doing about fraud? How do we get better at fraud? And different countries are taking different approaches and trying to learn from each other. Before we do, we had a question come in from Hamad. Ruth, I think this might be in your wheelhouse, but if not, we can pass, but we'll do our best. The question is really around data standardization. How hard is that when you're dealing with information and everybody's systems are different? I know when I've experienced some of these initiatives in the US, it's a big challenge just to get all the data synced up. So What can you say about that?
It's a great question. Thank you for that one. It is absolutely essential for multiple reasons, and one that, again, we're quite proud at CIFAS to have a pretty robust data standardization practice in place, which means that all information and data submitted into CIFAS meets a very particular standard, and therefore the value of the data to everybody is far in advance of where we don't necessarily have that same framework. So we, for example, have very strict specifications that our members need to meet when filing data to our databases, and therefore those using it have confidence that everyone is meeting that same standard. And I talked before about the governance framework. We obviously have our bespoke governance frameworks for each of our databases, which sets out the rules as to how data can be used and shared and filed. And that standardization is absolutely key to the value from it. I think there's also another further discussion around uses of technologies, machine learning, AI, etc., are all dependent on having a really solid data foundation, and that's a whole different topic of conversation altogether. But you really can't even start to apply more advanced learning models or advances in technology unless you have a really solid data foundation. So it's really key for us.
Yeah, so if you're keeping a list of those essential elements of information sharing before, data quality, data standardization are essential to being effective. Okay, thank you for answering that on the fly. Rachel, now let's turn back to you and get into some of what the UK is doing, because I think the UK is out ahead in terms of actions in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of the rest of the world, probably many of the people sitting here, are watching to see, okay, how does it work? What are the consequences? What are the unintended consequences of all of these things? And so I want to first talk about the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act, or ECTA, ECTA for short. That act does a lot of things, but I think the one probably most relevant to our discussion today is the one that creates a new failure to prevent fraud offense. So tell us a little bit about what that offense is and what FIs are doing to prepare.
Sure. Okay. So as you say, we call it ECTA because it's just the longest title ever for like a piece of legislation. Came into being in 2023. We've all been eagerly awaiting the guidance for failure to prevent fraud, the new offence, which will actually, the guidance came out a few weeks ago, and it will actually take effect in September 2025. The Act itself is quite far-reaching, and there's a lot of things in there about reforms to Companies House, reforms to prevent abuse of limited partnerships, crypto assets, and also AML powers. But failure to prevent, as you say, is the area that we've been sort of all waiting to find out, failure to prevent, for what's going to be in the guidance. And basically, the section in the Act on that covers organisations. They have to meet certain criteria. So it applies to large organisations that meet 2 out of 3 criteria. One is turnover of 36 million, a balance sheet of over 18 million, and having 250 employees. And so you can fall into liability for it with an employee or an associated person. So associated person could be a third party, could be a supplier, could be an agent. And the fraud itself has to be intended to benefit the organisation. And the third part of it is that the organisation did not have reasonable fraud prevention procedures in place. Now, that's kind of a key thing, which I'll talk about in a second. But there are some other things in part of this which sort of hit on it, which is the reform of the identification doctrine, which means that it's sort of quite technical, but it's about the directing mind. So if a person commits a crime, the organisation can be held liable, and this offence is a corporate offence. The actual reach of the Act is, it's a UK piece of legislation, but if an employee commits fraud under UK law or targets UK victims, their employers could be prosecuted, even if the organisation or employee is based overseas. So the reach is actually much further, and it covers quite a lot of offences. So all of the things that are covered within the UK Fraud Act, fraud by false representation, failing to disclose, and then there's other things like participation in a fraudulent business, false statements by companies, false accounting, and fraudulent trading, and cheating the public revenue. So what are people doing about it at the moment? Well, there are these reasonable procedures that people have to look at, and because it comes into effect in September 25, basically there's this amount of time, 9 months, to get your house in order. So there are 6 areas that people have to look at, and many people have started looking already. But first one is risk assessment, whole organisation risk assessment in respect of this particular area. Due diligence, so it'd be due diligence on suppliers and also employees. Commitment, and it's commitment from the top. And I think in the guidance, it actually says that part of that commitment is consistent messaging. So it's quite kind of robust. Monitoring and review. So it's not just good enough to have the policies in place. You have to show that you're monitoring them and reviewing them and kind of evidence that. And then there's also comms and training. So key to this, obviously, there's lots of people that could be involved and potentially could fall into scope of committing this fraud because it covers employees. That all staff training is really important, knowing what the red flags are and that you don't fall foul of it yourself. And then also having in place proportionate procedures. So you've got the right policies in place, whistleblowing, fraud prevention policies, strategies, and others. Now, I would say, sorry, I just need to cough for a second, that the guidance also says, because many people might have been thinking, oh, right, well, we do have a fraud strategy in place. We just need to add this offence in. Or, you know, we've got some communications policies in place around it. The guidance actually says that, I'm just going to look down to read it because it's really important to get it right, but merely applying existing procedures tailored to a different type of risk will not necessarily be an adequate response. So actually, when you're doing it, you do need to look at all of those 6 areas and in quite detail. And there is some evidence of you doing that and also reporting it internally. You know, you might have audit committees or scrutiny committees, but also reporting that upwards, and that there is that kind of top level commitment, the tone from the top, we all say, and you need to be able to show that you've done it in order to use it as a defence if you got caught in there. But, you know, as I say, there's an unlimited fine, but there's also that reputational damage that might come alongside it. It's quite an interesting piece of legislation, really.
Unlimited fine will raise some eyebrows, right? That
Yeah.
is definitely. But you know what strikes me as you're talking about that? One of the things I hear from a lot of people around the world is they're getting more questions from their regulators about fraud, but maybe without the framework. So what are you doing about fraud? What are you doing to prevent this?
Yeah.
You know, that guidance is very reasonable guidance for someone not in the UK to adopt and to say, hey, you know what I did? I looked at this. I've adopted a risk assessment. We've done training. We've done, you know, if you can walk your regulator wherever you are through those, boy, you're in a pretty good spot probably in being able to answer their questions and at least be ahead of the crowd.
Yeah. And I would say actually that the whole of this kind of area in respect of the offence actually should incentivize good governance, because, you know, there's some things there that you might have some of them in place already because it's not dissimilar. These reasonable procedures that are related to the failure to prevent fraud offence are very similar to the adequate procedures that are mentioned in the UK 2010 Bribery Act. But it wouldn't be enough to just tack it onto those procedures and say, oh, well, we've got it in place for bribery, it's good enough for this. You have to really actually do it. The other thing that is in the Act is the widening of the scope of the term senior manager. So it's not just the C-suite, it's people who have influence over doing things. So that could be, you know, it could be a procurement officer letting a contract or something like that. So that's kind of quite an interesting bit of the Act to have a look at.
That's really important. And that's important for anybody out there in the UK to think, do I now meet this new definition? What does that mean for me? What does that mean for my access to executives, the board? Yeah, all of those things that come into play.
Yeah, exactly. I think, you know, when you're doing your risk assessment and your due diligence, you'd be looking at those roles saying, where might we hit on this?
Yeah, exactly. Well, Ruth, I want to turn now to another piece of UK legislation that's gotten a lot of attention. It's been the piece of UK legislation that probably people have come to me to ask about most often, and it's the new mandatory reimbursement regime for victims, where in certain circumstances, financial institutions are required to reimburse victims of APP fraud. So again, this, you know, unauthorized fraud where they might not have the right controls in place. So just maybe the same thing as we asked Rachel to do with ECTA. Tell us a little bit about the requirements of this new regime, and then what you're hearing from members about how they're responding and just frankly what they're seeing.
Sure. So this has been years in the making in the UK, and really seeks to try to incentivise actors in the ecosystem to implement adequate controls to try to protect victims from authorised push payment fraud. So the Payment Systems Regulator brought in their new regulation on the 7th of October this year. It's fair to say the banking sector has been working tirelessly over the past sort of 12, 18 plus months to prepare themselves for implementing measures to ensure they can comply with the regulation, in addition to what they're already doing, of course. And bear in mind the context that a number of payment services providers in the UK were already part of a voluntary scheme reimbursing victims in the scenario where they had been the victim of APP fraud. But the regulation seeks to ensure that both the sending and receiving bank or building society payment services provider shares liability for reimbursing that victim. It's a 50-50 split of liability up to £85,000 with a small excess that's applicable. And that's a real change here, where many banks in the UK had been very much focused on, what was going out, and now the focus is also very much on sort of, it's more what was coming out, what was coming in, and more so now what's going out. So their focus has had to now be much broader than ever before to ensure that there's correct and adequate controls in place. But we're very, very early in the process. We've obviously been live with the regulation for a couple of months now. And it's had to really be a very collaborative effort as well to make sure that that the regulation has been implemented with all considerations. And rightly so, there's been a consultation period over an extended time to ensure that that the ecosystem is contributing their thoughts on that. It's fair to say that there's also a number of agencies and players in the banking sector who are all keeping a very keen eye to check that we aren't seeing an increase in first-party fraud. Obviously, the regulation is fantastic for victims and really is trailblazing for the UK. But there could be an argument to say that first-party fraud may increase as a result, as there may be individuals that see this as a lucrative opportunity. However, because we're already very much keeping a keen eye on that, we've managed to put in controls to ensure the scheme isn't abused, and we'll be continuing to keep our eye on that, both in terms of opportunistic opportunities, but also serious and organised fraud opportunities to check that we're not seeing anything more large scale in terms of abuse of the system. But again, collaboration is so key here, that there is so much more we can do to bring all parties with touch points across the ecosystem to play their part in prevention. We feel that CIFAS has a really key role to play because we operate across so many different sectors and bring players together. But we really do see that there's an opportunity for the technology side of businesses, that we see those sort of tech players and also telcos involved in this, because so much is obviously originating from online. We'd really like to see an awful lot more done on the prevent side of APP fraud, rather than it being a disproportionate system where there's one section of the fraud prevention community that are carrying the load. So really CIFAS is very, very keen to do what we can to bring parties together within our membership community to see what more we can do.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. There's a lot of really great questions that we're not going to be able to get to today around the role of technology, some around social media. The UK is actually doing some interesting stuff with social media companies and influencers. So is Singapore. There's questions about behavioral analytics, all great stuff. So I'll try to answer some of them in the chat, but go check out the CIFAS website and the resources. ACAMS has a fraud hub where we've covered already a lot of this. We're going to do a lot more of that in 2025. We have our new certified anti-financial fraud specialist certification that'll get you all up to speed. There's really a lot of resources out there, but that we just couldn't cover today. So thank you to everyone out there, first of all, for joining us today. We appreciate it. Thank you, Ruth and Rachel, so much for what you do for the community, really. I mean, this is so important. This is the information sharing is the way that we will fight back against the fraudsters. And you guys are doing such important work. You're trailblazers. And I just appreciate it so much for you taking the time today to hang out with us for a little while.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, everyone. And we'll see you next time on ACAMS Live.